I never imagined that HOA Karen would trespass into my cabin with cops, completely unaware that I am the judge they answer to. But there I was, standing in my own doorway at 8 p.m. on a Tuesday, staring at the most brazen display of illegal authority I'd witnessed in my 20-year legal career. The cabin door hung wide open. My private sanctuary, nestled deep in the Colorado mountains, had been violated. Inside, I could hear voices, aggressive, entitled voices that made my blood pressure spike instantly. I stepped through the threshold, and the scene before me defied belief. Karen Whitfield, the self-appointed HOA president of our mountain community, stood in my living room, holding one of my personal legal documents. Two uniformed officers flanked her, their flashlights sweeping across my grandfather's war memorabilia like they were searching for contraband. One cop was rifling through my desk drawers. The other photographed my bookshelf. "Excuse me," I said, my voice carrying the authority that comes from years on the bench. "What exactly is happening in my home?" Karen turned toward me with that smirk I'd grown to despise over the past 6 months. She wore her usual HOA power outfit, a navy blazer, with an oversized badge reading community standards, enforcement like she was some kind of federal agent instead of a retired real estate agent with too much time on her hands. "Mr. Harrison," she said, deliberately avoiding my proper title, "we're conducting a lawful inspection of this property for HOA violations. You've been non-compliant for months." The audacity hit me like a physical blow. This woman had just admitted to breaking and entering while standing in my living room, surrounded by evidence of her crime. I glanced at the officers, expecting them to show some sign of discomfort, some recognition that this situation had crossed every legal line imaginable. Instead, Officer Martinez, whose badge I made note of, continued photographing my belongings. "Sir, we're here on official HOA business. Mrs. Whitfield has authority to inspect properties in violation of community standards." I felt that familiar courtroom calm settle over me, the same feeling I got when an attorney walked into an obvious trap during cross-examination. Karen had no idea who she was dealing with, and these officers were about to learn a very expensive lesson about due process. "Authority?" I repeated, pulling out my phone to start recording. "What authority exactly gives you the right to break into my private residence without a warrant, without my consent, and without any legal justification whatsoever?" Karen's smirk widened. She actually stepped closer, invading my personal space like a playground bully who'd never been checked. "The HOA covenant agreement gives me authority to inspect any property for violations. You signed that agreement when you inherited this hovel." She gestured dismissively at my cabin, the same cabin where my grandfather had found peace after 3 tours in Vietnam, where I'd spent every summer as a child, where I now came to escape the weight of making life-altering decisions for other people every single day. "This property is in clear violation of community standards," she continued, her voice rising with manufactured authority. "Unkempt landscaping, non-approved exterior modifications, and failure to pay increased HOA dues. I have every right to be here." The officers nodded along like trained seals. Officer Rodriguez, the one searching my desk, actually had the gall to pull out a citation book. "We can write this up as a wellness check if you prefer, sir." Mrs. Whitfield expressed concerns about the property's condition. I looked between these 3 individuals who had just committed multiple felonies in my presence, and I realized something profound. They genuinely believed they were untouchable. Karen had cultivated this little kingdom of corruption so successfully that even law enforcement officers were willing to participate in her illegal schemes. The most beautiful part: none of them had bothered to ask what I did for a living. In 6 months of harassment, Karen had never once inquired about my profession. She saw the cabin, made assumptions about my income and connections, and decided I was an easy target. She was about to discover just how wrong she could be. "You know what, Karen?" I said, still recording everything. "You're absolutely right about one thing. This situation definitely needs to be resolved through proper legal channels." Her victory smile stretched wider. "Finally, some cooperation. Officer Martinez, please continue documenting these violations." I stepped back and watched them work, my mind already 3 steps ahead. In the courtroom, I'd learned that the most dangerous opponents were the ones who didn't know they were already defeated. Karen wasn't just confident, she was reckless. And reckless people always provided the best evidence against themselves. What she didn't know was that in approximately 16 hours, she would be standing in my courtroom, facing charges that would destroy everything she'd built. But for now, I let her enjoy her moment of perceived victory. After all, the higher they climb, the harder they fall. To understand why this violation cut so deep, you need to know what this cabin meant to me. This wasn't just another property dispute or HOA, power struggle. This was personal warfare against everything I held sacred. My grandfather, Staff Sergeant William Harrison, built this cabin with his own hands in 1978. After surviving 3 tours in Vietnam, he needed a place where the only orders came from the changing seasons, and the only deadlines were sunrise and sunset. He'd spend months up here, turning raw timber into something beautiful, something lasting, something peaceful. I was 8 years old when he first brought me up the winding mountain road. "Billy," he said, using the nickname that died with him, "sometimes a man needs a place where he can think clearly, where the noise of the world can't reach him." He taught me to fish in the creek behind the cabin, to identify different bird calls, to find north without a compass. Most importantly, he taught me that some places are sacred not because they're perfect, but because they're yours. When he passed 5 years ago, he left me the cabin in his will. Not to my father, not to my uncle, but to me. His reasoning was simple. Billy understands what this place means. He'll protect it. Those words felt like a sacred trust, a responsibility that went beyond simple property ownership. As a district judge, my life revolved around other people's worst moments. Every day, I made decisions that altered families, ended careers, and determined futures. I sentenced criminals, mediated bitter divorces, and ruled on cases that would haunt the parties involved for years. The weight of that responsibility was crushing, and this cabin was the only place where I could set it down. Here, I wasn't Judge Harrison. I wasn't the man who held people's fates in his hands. I was just Bill, sitting on his grandfather's porch, watching eagles circle the peaks, feeling small and human and connected to something larger than courtrooms and legal briefs. Karen had been systematically trying to destroy that peace for 6 months. It started innocuously enough, a letter about maintaining community standards and ensuring my property reflects the high-quality image we're building. I ignored it. Mountain people minded their own business, and I assumed she'd eventually find someone else to bother. I was wrong. The letters escalated. Suddenly, my rustic cabin was an eyesore. My grandfather's carefully cultivated wildflower garden was unkempt landscaping. The solar panels he'd installed to live off-grid were non-approved exterior modifications. The wooden fence he'd built to mark the property line was not in compliance with HOA aesthetic standards. Each letter became more aggressive, more entitled, more personal. Karen wasn't just targeting my property, she was attacking my family's legacy. She wanted me to tear down the hand-carved sign that read Harrison's Haven because it wasn't professionally manufactured. She demanded I remove my grandfather's flagpole because it exceeded the approved height specifications she'd invented. The breaking point came when she demanded access to inspect the interior of my cabin. Not just the property, but my private living space. When I refused, she threatened legal action. When I reminded her that I was within my rights to deny entry, she escalated to harassment. Suddenly, my property taxes were being investigated for potential fraud. The county health department received anonymous tips about possible septic system violations. The fire department got calls about potential hazards that required immediate inspection. Every agency that could make my life difficult received carefully crafted complaints designed to force me into compliance. But Karen made one critical miscalculation. She assumed I was just another weekender, someone with shallow roots and no real connections to the community. She never asked about my background, never investigated who I was or what resources I had at my disposal. In her mind, I was a target of opportunity, someone who would eventually cave under pressure and either conform to her vision or sell and leave. She couldn't have been more wrong. This cabin wasn't just my retreat, it was my anchor. It connected me to my grandfather's memory, to my own sense of purpose, to the man I was before I became a judge. Attacking this place wasn't just harassment. It was an assault on my family's history, my personal sanctuary, and everything that kept me grounded in an impossible job. Standing in my violated living room, watching these three criminals document their illegal search, I felt something I rarely experienced on the bench: personal investment in the outcome. This wasn't about legal precedent or constitutional principle. This was about justice for my grandfather, protection for my sanctuary, and ensuring that people like Karen learned that some lines should never be crossed. She wanted a fight? She was about to get one from someone uniquely qualified to finish it. The tension in my living room was electric as I watched Karen direct her illegal search like some kind of pseudo-law enforcement commander. But I could see cracks forming in her confident facade. The officers were starting to shift uncomfortably, and I knew exactly how to widen those cracks. "Karen," I said, my voice taking on the measured tone I used when attorneys pushed too far in my courtroom. "I need you to listen very carefully. You and these officers are currently committing multiple felonies in my presence." She laughed, actually laughed like I'd just told her a joke. "Oh, please. Don't try to intimidate me with legal threats. I've dealt with plenty of property owners who think they know the law. You signed the HOA agreement, which clearly states nothing about warrantless searches of private residences," I interrupted. "Nothing about breaking and entering. Nothing about conspiracy to commit burglary." Officer Martinez finally looked up from photographing my bookshelf. Something in my tone was getting through to him, that courtroom authority that made people instinctively straighten their posture and pay attention. "Sir, Mrs. Whitfield assured us this was a legitimate inspection. She has documentation. Documentation that gives her the right to break into my home while I'm away?" I asked. "Documentation that supersedes the Fourth Amendment? I'd love to see that paperwork." Karen stepped between us, her face flushed with anger. "Don't listen to him, Martinez. This is exactly what these difficult homeowners do. They try to confuse the issue with legal mumbo-jumbo. We have clear authority here." I pulled out my phone and began scrolling through my contacts. "You know what? Let's clear this up right now. I'm calling Sheriff Davidson. We can get his opinion on your authority to conduct warrantless searches." The color drained from Karen's face. Sheriff Davidson was a man I'd worked with for 15 years, someone who testified in my courtroom dozens of times, someone who knew exactly who I was and what I did for a living. "That won't be necessary," Officer Rodriguez said quickly. "We can handle this situation ourselves." But Karen, drunk on her own perceived power, made the fatal error of doubling down. "Actually, go ahead and call him. Sheriff Davidson and I have worked together on several community issues. He'll back up our authority here." I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. Instead, I dialed the number. "Evening, Tom," I said when the sheriff picked up. "This is Bill Harrison. I'm up at the cabin, and I have a situation I need your input on." "Judge Harrison? What's going on up there?" The silence in the room was deafening. I watched Karen's face transform as she processed what she'd just heard. Judge Harrison. Not Mr. Harrison. Not Bill from the cabin. Judge Harrison. Well, Tom, I came home to find HOA President Karen Whitfield and 2 of your officers conducting an illegal search of my residence. No warrant, no consent, no exigent circumstances. They broke in while I was away and were going through my personal belongings when I arrived. They what? Sheriff Davidson's voice carried clearly through the speaker. Which officers? Martinez and Rodriguez. They claim Mrs. Whitfield has authority to conduct these searches based on HOA agreements. The profanity that erupted from Sheriff Davidson's end of the line would have made a sailor blush. Judge, those officers are operating completely outside their authority. HOA agreements don't override constitutional protections. They know better. Karen's world was crumbling in real time. I could see her mind racing, trying to process how she'd miscalculated so catastrophically. The man she'd been harassing for 6 months, the property owner she'd dismissed as a powerless weekend warrior, was a district judge. Not just any judge, the judge who handled criminal cases in this county. Officer Martinez looked like he was going to be sick. Judge Harrison, we were told this was a legitimate inspection. Mrs. Whitfield said she had legal authority. Officers, Sheriff Davidson's voice cut through the excuses. You will immediately cease any search activity and exit that residence. Judge Harrison, do you want to press charges? Karen finally found her voice, but it came out as a desperate whisper. You're a judge? You're actually a judge? I nodded slowly, watching her process the implications. Every harassment letter, every false complaint, every illegal action she'd taken against me over the past 6 months, all of it had been directed at a sitting district judge, someone with the power to issue warrants, set bail, and determine her fate if she ever appeared in his courtroom. 6 months, I said quietly. 6 months you've been harassing me, filing false reports, and now breaking into my home. 6 months, you could have simply asked what I did for a living. Officer Rodriguez was already backing toward the door. Judge, we're going to leave immediately. This was clearly a misunderstanding. A misunderstanding? I let that sink in. Officers, you participated in an illegal search of a judge's residence. You photographed personal documents, rifled through private belongings, and violated every principle of due process you swore to uphold. This isn't a misunderstanding. This is criminal conduct. Karen tried one last desperate play. This doesn't change anything. You still violated HOA regulations. Your position doesn't put you above community standards. Karen, I said, and something in my voice made everyone in the room freeze. I want you to think very carefully about your next words, because in about 8 hours, I'm going to be sitting in my courtroom, and you're going to wish you'd stopped talking about 5 minutes ago. The threat hung in the air like smoke. Karen's mouth opened and closed, like a fish gasping for air. She'd built her entire sense of power on intimidating people she perceived as weaker than herself. But standing in front of her now wasn't a weekend homeowner or a powerless victim. Standing in front of her was the one person in this county with the authority to make her life a living hell. And she'd just given him every reason to do exactly that. Tom, I said into the phone, I think we need to have a formal discussion about this situation. Can you send someone up here to document the scene? Already dispatching a supervisor, Judge. This situation requires a full investigation. As I hung up, I looked at the 3 people who had just destroyed their own lives through sheer arrogance and ignorance. Karen had spent 6 months trying to force me from my sanctuary. Instead, she'd just handed me the keys to her complete destruction. The confrontation was over. The real fight was about to begin. Over the next 48 hours, I discovered that Karen's corruption ran deeper than I'd imagined. What I'd initially dismissed as petty HOA tyranny was actually a sophisticated network of bribery, intimidation, and abuse of power that stretched through multiple county departments. The investigation began immediately. Sheriff Davidson's supervisor, Lieutenant Brooks, arrived within an hour and documented everything: the broken lock on my front door, the disturbed contents of my desk, the photographs the officers had taken of my personal documents. But as we dug deeper, a disturbing pattern emerged. "Judge, we need to talk privately," Lieutenant Brooks said, after interviewing the officers. "This situation is bigger than a simple HOA dispute." He showed me a folder thick with complaints against Karen, not from homeowners, but from county employees. Code enforcement officers who'd been pressured to write bogus violations. Health department inspectors who'd been offered cash to find problems that didn't exist. Even clerks in the tax assessor's office who'd been asked to flag certain properties for special attention. "She's been running a protection racket," Brooks explained. "Homeowners who comply with her demands get left alone. Those who resist face an avalanche of official harassment until they either conform or leave." The scope was staggering. Karen had turned the HOA into a criminal enterprise, using her connections with corrupt officials to weaponize government agencies against anyone who challenged her authority. She'd been collecting illegal fees, approving construction projects in exchange for kickbacks, and systematically driving out residents who couldn't be bought or intimidated. But here's where it got personal. I was supposed to be her biggest victory. The weekend judge with the expensive cabin who thought his legal knowledge made him untouchable. She'd been bragging to her network about how she was going to break the arrogant lawyer and turn my property into a showcase for her vision of the community. My phone started ringing at 6 a.m. Karen, calling from a number I didn't recognize. "Judge Harrison," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "I think there's been a terrible misunderstanding. Perhaps we could meet and discuss this situation like reasonable adults?" "Karen, you're aware that you're currently under investigation for multiple felonies, correct?" "That's exactly why we need to talk. This whole thing has been blown completely out of proportion. I was simply trying to maintain community standards. Maybe I got a little overzealous, but my heart was in the right place." The audacity was breathtaking. Even after being caught red-handed, she still believed she could charm or manipulate her way out of consequences. But I could hear something else in her voice: desperation. Word was spreading through her network, and people were starting to distance themselves. "Here's what's going to happen, Karen. You're going to cooperate fully with the investigation. You're going to provide documentation of every bribe, every threat, every illegal action you've taken in your role as HOA president. And you're going to pray that the district attorney feels merciful." She laughed, but it sounded forced. "You think you can intimidate me? I have friends in this county too, Judge Harrison. Important friends who won't appreciate you targeting a respected community leader over a simple property dispute." That's when I realized she still didn't understand the gravity of her situation. In her mind, this was still a negotiation between equals. She genuinely believed her network of corrupt officials and intimidated homeowners could protect her from a sitting district judge. The calls continued throughout the day. First, County Commissioner Bradley, who'd apparently received several anonymous donations from Karen over the years. "Bill, maybe we could work something out here. Karen's been a valuable community volunteer. Perhaps a warning would be more appropriate than criminal charges." Then, City Councilman Peters, whose wife had mysteriously won several HOA-sponsored contests for best landscaping. "Judge Harrison, I understand there's been some kind of misunderstanding with Mrs. Whitfield. She's done so much for our community. Surely we can find a way to resolve this without destroying her reputation?" Each call made me more disgusted with the extent of Karen's influence. She'd corrupted officials at every level of local government, creating a web of mutual benefit that protected her illegal activities. These weren't just character references. They were desperate attempts to protect a criminal enterprise that benefited multiple parties. But Karen's most brazen move came that evening. She showed up at my courthouse chambers, somehow talking her way past security, carrying a manila folder thick with documents. "Judge Harrison, I have something that might interest you," she said, settling into the chair across from my desk like she'd been invited. "I've done some research into your family's property history." She opened the folder with theatrical flourish. "It seems your grandfather may not have had clear title when he built that cabin. There are some discrepancies in the land records, some unpaid taxes from the 1970s that could create problems. It would be a shame if these issues came to light during a contentious legal proceeding." I stared at this woman who had just threatened to attack my grandfather's memory and my legal right to the property he'd left me. She was sitting in my chambers, in my courthouse, attempting to blackmail a sitting judge with fabricated property disputes. "Karen," I said slowly, "you just committed extortion against a district judge in a government building. You do understand that, don't you?" Her confidence flickered for just a moment. "I'm simply providing information that might be relevant to our situation. I'm sure a man in your position would want to avoid any complication that might affect your reputation." I reached for my phone to call security, but Karen held up her hand. "Before you do anything rash, Judge Harrison, you should know that several prominent community members are prepared to testify about your hostile and vindictive behavior toward community volunteers. Your conduct during this entire situation has been highly inappropriate for someone in your position." She was doubling down again, threatening to attack my judicial reputation with false testimony from her network of corrupt accomplices. Even facing multiple felony charges, she believed she could still intimidate me into backing down. What she didn't realize was that every word she'd just spoken had been recorded by the security system in my chambers, a system she'd walked past multiple warning signs to reach me. I smiled and pressed the button to call security. "Karen, you just made this so much easier for the prosecution." As security escorted her from the building, I realized that Karen's arrogance was going to be her downfall. Instead of accepting responsibility and seeking a plea bargain, she was escalating at every opportunity, creating new charges and providing evidence of her own criminal intent. Tomorrow, she would face the full weight of the justice system. And she had no one to blame but herself. The beauty of being a judge isn't just the authority, it's understanding exactly how the system works and knowing which pieces need to move in perfect sequence to achieve justice. Karen had handed me a masterclass in criminal behavior, and I was about to teach her a masterclass in consequences. My first call was to District Attorney Sarah Chen, someone I'd worked with for over a decade on complex criminal cases. Sarah was brilliant, methodical, and absolutely ruthless when it came to prosecuting corruption. "Bill, I've been reviewing the preliminary reports from Sheriff Davidson. This is bigger than we initially thought, isn't it?" "Much bigger. Karen Whitfield has been operating a criminal enterprise disguised as an HOA. We have documented evidence of bribery, extortion, conspiracy, breaking and entering, and as of yesterday, attempted blackmail of a sitting judge." Sarah's whistle came through clearly. "She actually tried to blackmail you? In your chambers?" "Fully recorded. She threatened to fabricate property disputes against my grandfather's estate if I didn't drop the charges. Then she threatened to have her network of corrupt officials testify about my inappropriate conduct as a judge." Jesus, Bill. She's either incredibly stupid or incredibly desperate. "Both," I said, "and that's going to work in our favor. Every time she's faced pressure, she's escalated instead of backing down. She's created a paper trail that reads like a how-to manual for public corruption. Sarah and I spent the next 3 hours mapping out the prosecution strategy. We weren't just going after Karen, we were dismantling her entire network. Every official who'd taken her bribes, every employee who'd participated in her harassment campaigns, every elected official who'd tried to interfere with the investigation. This is going to send shockwaves through the county, Sarah warned. Some powerful people are going to be very unhappy with us. Good, I replied. Maybe it's time they learned that corruption has consequences. The next phase was documentation. I'd been methodical about preserving evidence from day one, but now I went deeper. Security footage from my property showing Karen trespassing. Bank records showing suspicious payments to county employees. Email chains revealing the conspiracy to harass me through false official complaints. My court reporter, Jennifer, had been with me for 8 years. She was discreet, thorough, and absolutely loyal to the principles of justice. Judge, I've transcribed the recording from your chambers yesterday. Mrs. Whitfield's statements constitute clear evidence of extortion and conspiracy. She also made several admissions about previous illegal activities. The recording was damning. Karen had essentially confessed to orchestrating the entire harassment campaign, admitted to having arrangements with multiple officials, and explicitly threatened to fabricate evidence if I didn't comply with her demands. But the most beautiful part was what came next. I reached out to internal affairs departments in every agency Karen had corrupted. I provided them with evidence, documentation, and witness statements. Within hours, officers were being suspended, inspectors were being questioned, and elected officials were lawyering up. The domino effect was spectacular. Officer Martinez, facing termination and criminal charges, immediately agreed to cooperate. He provided detailed statements about Karen's instructions, the payments he'd received, and the other illegal searches he participated in. She told us you were just some rich guy who bought a cabin and thought he was above community rules, Martinez admitted during his interview. She said you'd been causing problems and needed to be put in your place. We never asked what you did for a living. She said it didn't matter. County Inspector Williams was next to flip. Faced with evidence of the bribes he'd accepted, he provided a complete accounting of Karen's corruption network. Fake violations, manufactured emergencies, pressure campaigns against property owners who wouldn't pay Karen's illegal fees. She had a system, Williams explained. Homeowners who paid her expedited processing fees got quick approvals and no surprise inspections. Those who refused got hit with violation after violation until they either paid up or moved away. The evidence was overwhelming. Bank deposits that coincided with favorable HOA decisions. Text messages coordinating harassment campaigns. Email threads discussing how to handle problem residents through official channels. But Karen still didn't understand she was beaten. She hired attorney Robert Maxwell, an expensive criminal defense lawyer known for representing white-collar criminals and corrupt politicians. Maxwell's strategy was predictable: attack my credibility and claim I was abusing my judicial position for personal revenge. Your Honor, he said, during Karen's arraignment in front of Judge Patricia Hoffman, I had recused myself, obviously. My client is the victim of a vindictive prosecution by a judge who couldn't handle being held accountable to community standards. Judge Harrison has weaponized the legal system against a volunteer community leader who is simply doing her job. It was a desperate play that ignored the mountain of evidence against his client. Maxwell was hoping to turn this into a story about judicial overreach rather than criminal corruption. Judge Hoffman wasn't buying it. Mr. Maxwell, your client is charged with breaking and entering, conspiracy, bribery, extortion, and attempted blackmail of a sitting judge. These charges are supported by physical evidence, recorded conversations, financial records, and witness testimony. This isn't about HOA disputes, this is about criminal conduct. Bail was set at $50,000. Karen's face went white when she realized she'd have to pay $5,000 to a bondsman just to get out of jail pending trial. As she was led away in handcuffs, she looked back at me, sitting in the gallery. For the first time since this all began, I saw fear in her eyes. Real fear. The kind that comes when you finally understand that your actions have consequences, and those consequences are about to destroy everything you've built. The arraignment was just the beginning. In 2 weeks, Karen would stand trial in my courtroom, not as the defendant, which would require my recusal, but as a witness in the prosecution of her co-conspirators. She was going to have to testify under oath about her criminal enterprise, while I sat 10 feet away, presiding over her complete humiliation. Justice wasn't just coming for Karen Whitfield. Justice was coming with interest, penalties, and a front-row seat to watch her world burn. 3 weeks later, Karen Whitfield walked into my courtroom for what she believed was a routine HOA enforcement hearing. She had no idea she was about to experience the most devastating 10 minutes of her life. The irony was perfect. Karen's attorney had filed a motion seeking judicial enforcement of HOA regulations against my property, one final desperate attempt to salvage something from the wreckage of her criminal case. Maxwell thought he was being clever, forcing me to recuse myself or face accusations of bias. Instead, I did something he didn't expect. I accepted the case. Karen strutted into courtroom 3, wearing her power suit and carrying a briefcase full of fabricated violations. She'd convinced herself that this was her moment of vindication, the day she'd finally proved that even judges weren't above community standards. She took her seat at the plaintiff's table, whispering confidently to Maxwell about how this hearing would expose my abuse of judicial authority. From where I sat at the bench, I could see her practicing the victim narrative she planned to present. "Your Honor," Maxwell began, "we're here today to address serious violations of community standards by a property owner who believes his position exempts him from the rules that govern everyone else." Karen nodded along, her face radiating self-righteousness. She'd been planning this moment for weeks, preparing her testimony about my retaliatory prosecution and vindictive behavior. "Mr. Maxwell," I said, "before we proceed, I want to ensure your client understands the nature of these proceedings. Mrs. Whitfield, you are aware that this is my courtroom, correct?" Karen's head snapped up. For the first time, she looked directly at me, not at some generic judge, but at me, Judge William Harrison, sitting behind the bench in my own courtroom. The color drained from her face as the full implications hit her. This wasn't a hearing in front of some neutral third party. This was Karen Whitfield, criminal defendant, asking the judge she'd harassed, threatened, and attempted to blackmail to rule in her favor on a civil matter. "Your Honor, I didn't realize." She stammered. "You didn't realize what, Mrs. Whitfield? That actions have consequences? That the legal system you've been trying to manipulate for months actually works?" Maxwell jumped to his feet. "Your Honor, I move for your immediate recusal based on clear bias and personal involvement." "Motion denied," I said calmly. Mrs. Whitfield chose to file this action in my court. She had every opportunity to request a different judge. Since she didn't, I'm assuming she's comfortable with my impartiality. Karen looked like she was having trouble breathing. The woman who'd spent months terrorizing me and my neighbors was discovering what it felt like to be completely powerless. "Now, Mrs. Whitfield, let's review your claims. You allege that my property violates HOA standards and that I've been non-responsive to your authority as president. Is that correct?" She nodded weakly, unable to speak. "Interesting, because according to the evidence presented in your criminal trial, you admitted under oath that you fabricated most of these violations as part of a harassment campaign designed to force me from my property. Were you lying then, or are you lying now?" Maxwell was frantically shuffling papers, trying to find some legal basis to escape the trap his client had walked into. Your Honor, my client's statements in unrelated criminal proceedings shouldn't be considered. Unrelated? I interrupted. Mr. Maxwell, your client is asking me to enforce violations that she admitted were fabricated as part of a criminal conspiracy. How exactly is that unrelated? The courtroom was dead silent. Karen's mouth was opening and closing like a fish out of water. She'd come here to humiliate me, and instead she was watching her last desperate gambit collapse in real time. Mrs. Whitfield, I continued, you also claimed that I failed to pay increased HOA dues. Could you provide documentation of the legal basis for these increases? She fumbled through her briefcase, pulling out papers with shaking hands. The board voted to increase assessments for property improvements. Which board meeting? What was the vote count? Were proper notices given to homeowners? More fumbling, more silence. Karen hadn't bothered with legal formalities because she'd never expected to be challenged by someone who actually understood the law. We. The board has authority to set rates. Mrs. Whitfield, according to the HOA bylaws, assessment increases require a supermajority vote after 30 days written notice to all members. Did that happen? I don't. I'm not sure of the exact procedures. You're not sure? You've been HOA president for 3 years, and you're not sure of the basic legal requirements for your actions? Each question was a surgical strike, exposing the complete lack of legal foundation for everything she'd done. This wasn't just about my property. This was about holding her accountable for years of illegal conduct, disguised as community leadership. Furthermore, Mrs. Whitfield, you're asking this court to enforce agreements that you yourself violated through criminal conduct. You broke into my property, conspired with corrupt officials, and attempted extortion. Why should this court grant you any relief whatsoever? Karen finally broke. Your Honor, I made some mistakes. I got overzealous about community standards, but that doesn't mean the violations aren't real. Mistakes, I leaned forward. Mrs. Whitfield, you committed multiple felonies. You corrupted public officials. You terrorized homeowners. You turned a volunteer position into a criminal enterprise. Those aren't mistakes, they're choices. The gavel came down with finality. Motion denied in its entirety. All claims dismissed with prejudice. Mrs. Whitfield, you are hereby permanently enjoined from any enforcement actions against my property or any other property in the community. Your authority as HOA president is terminated, and you are banned from holding any position of authority within the organization. Karen collapsed into her chair, her world completely destroyed. The woman who'd walked in expecting vindication was walking out with nothing, no authority, no respect, no future in the community she'd tried to control. Court is adjourned, I announced. Mrs. Whitfield, I'll see you next week for sentencing on your criminal charges. As she stumbled from the courtroom, broken and defeated, I felt something I rarely experienced on the bench: perfect satisfaction. Justice hadn't just been served, it had been delivered with surgical precision by the very system she'd tried to corrupt. Karen Whitfield had finally learned what happens when you pick a fight with someone who owns the battlefield. If I thought Karen's courtroom humiliation would be the end of it, I was wrong. Desperate people do desperate things, and Karen Whitfield was about to prove just how far someone will go when they have nothing left to lose. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for the following Friday. Karen faced 18 months in state prison, plus restitution to every homeowner she'd illegally harassed. Her criminal defense attorney had negotiated the best deal possible, considering the mountain of evidence against her. But Karen wasn't done fighting. 2 days before sentencing, my phone rang at 11 p.m. Unknown number, local area code. Judge Harrison? This is Karen Whitfield. I need to speak with you. The audacity was breathtaking. A criminal defendant calling the judge, handling her case directly, violating every rule of legal procedure and common sense. Karen, you cannot be calling me directly. You need to hang up immediately and contact your attorney. Please, just listen for 1 minute, she begged. I've lost everything. My husband filed for divorce. My children won't speak to me. The HOA board voted me out unanimously. I'm going to lose my house to pay the restitution. Isn't that enough? I could hear tears in her voice, but I felt no sympathy. Karen, these are the consequences of your choices. You had multiple opportunities to stop, to apologize, to make things right. Instead, you escalated at every turn. I know I made mistakes, but 18 months in prison for HOA violations. For criminal conspiracy, bribery, extortion, and attempted blackmail of a judge, I corrected. This isn't about HOA violations, and you know it. She was quiet for a moment, then her voice changed, became harder, more calculating. Judge Harrison, I want you to know that I've been keeping detailed records of our interactions. Your behavior throughout this entire process has been vindictive and inappropriate. Here we go again. Even facing prison time, she was still trying to threaten me. I'm hanging up now, Karen. This conversation is being recorded, and I'll be forwarding it to the district attorney as evidence of witness intimidation. Wait, she screamed. I have information about other judges. Judges who've taken payments, who've fixed cases. Real corruption, not this petty HOA nonsense you're destroying my life over. I paused. This was either desperation or another trap. Karen, if you have evidence of judicial corruption, you need to report it to the appropriate authorities through your attorney. Calling me directly isn't. Judge Martinez took $20,000 to dismiss a DUI case last year. Judge Thompson has been having an affair with a prosecutor and ruling in favor of her cases. I have documentation, photographs, recordings. My blood ran cold. If Karen was telling the truth, she'd uncovered serious ethical violations that needed to be investigated. But if this was another manipulation attempt, Karen, I'm going to hang up now. If you have credible evidence of corruption, you need to. I'll give you everything, she interrupted. All of it. In exchange for a suspended sentence. And there it was. The real purpose of this call wasn't confession or cooperation. It was one final attempt at blackmail. She was trying to trade information about other judges' misconduct for leniency in her own case. Karen, you just committed another felony. Attempting to influence a judge's sentencing decision through threats or bribes is a separate criminal offense. I'm not threatening anyone. I'm offering to cooperate with investigations of real corruption through your defense attorney and the proper channels, not through direct contact with the sentencing judge. I hung up and immediately called District Attorney Chen. The recording of Karen's call would be entered into evidence, and she'd be facing additional charges for witness intimidation and attempted bribery. But Karen's desperation was just beginning. The next morning, I arrived at the courthouse to find protesters outside. About a dozen people holding signs reading "Justice for Karen" and "Corrupt Judge Abuses Power." My bailiff, Deputy Thompson, met me at the side entrance. Judge, we've got a situation. Mrs. Whitfield organized this protest overnight. She's been telling people that you're persecuting her for challenging your illegal cabin additions. The lies were getting more elaborate. Karen had convinced these people, probably other HOA members she hadn't yet alienated, that I was the real criminal, abusing my judicial authority to silence a community volunteer who discovered my illegal activities. She's also been calling local news stations, Thompson continued. Channel 7 wants an interview about judicial overreach in mountain communities. I watched the protesters through the window. These people genuinely believed they were fighting injustice. standing up for a victim of judicial abuse. Karen had manipulated them just like she'd manipulated county officials, turning her criminal prosecution into a story about corrupt judges silencing brave community leaders. But her media strategy backfired spectacularly. Channel 7 investigated her claims and discovered the truth. Karen Whitfield wasn't a victim of judicial overreach. She was a convicted criminal who'd built a network of corruption and harassment, then tried to blackmail the judge handling her case. The news story that aired that evening was devastating. HOA president's criminal empire exposed. They interviewed homeowners who'd been terrorized by Karen's harassment campaigns, showed documentation of her bribes to county officials, and played recordings of her attempted extortion. By Friday morning, the protesters were gone. The Justice for Karen movement had evaporated once people learned the truth about their champion. Karen arrived at sentencing, looking like a broken woman. The designer suits were gone, replaced by a simple dress that hung loose on her diminished frame. Her husband sat in the back row, but on the opposite side from her family, a visual reminder of how completely she'd destroyed her personal life. "Mrs. Whitfield," I said, before pronouncing sentence, "you have shown no genuine remorse for your actions. Even facing imprisonment, you continued to threaten, manipulate, and attempt to corrupt the judicial process. Your conduct demonstrates that you view the law as something to be circumvented rather than respected." The sentence was the full 18 months, plus 3 years probation, plus restitution that would likely bankrupt her. Karen's legs buckled as the bailiff approached with handcuffs. As she was led away to begin her prison term, she looked back at me one last time. The arrogance was gone, the entitlement was gone, the smug confidence was gone. All that remained was a broken woman facing the consequences of a lifetime of believing rules didn't apply to her. Karen Whitfield had finally learned that some battles you simply cannot win, especially when you choose the wrong opponent.